Brother, I got good scripture kind of like goes along what you're saying and all this.
Read it quick.
I'll read it. Psalms 51, verse number 5 says, "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." That means we was born. We're born in sin already.
Right.
A lot of people don't realize that though, but go ahead.
Yeah. The fall.
Yeah.
The fall. You know, in today's world, we're taught to think. Right? We're taught to think that inside every individual is a good heart.
Yeah.
But that's not true. That's 60s gibberish.
People scoff when I basically tell them about David's mournful psalm in Psalm 51. In Psalm 51, David is in fact mourning over his sinful relationship with Bathsheba. And as he talks about his relationship with Bathsheba, having killed her husband Uriah, having conspired to have him killed with one of his greatest captains, getting his captain to move Uriah up close to the wall so that somebody would drop something over the wall and kill him. And sure enough, Uriah was killed. Why was he having Uriah killed? Because David was having relationship with Uriah's wife. He was committing fornication, he conspired, he lied, and he killed Uriah. And then the prophet Nathan comes to him and tells him that he's been caught and the child that is conceived in Bathsheba is going to die. And David writes a mournful psalm in which he says that he had sinned against God and God only. And he basically then says that God is righteous and just. And he mourns in verse 5 and says, "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." Folks, David is not telling us that he was born in sin. David is mourning about his condition. And in mourning about his condition, he basically is reminded, listen, the way I came into creation, the way I came into existence actually was a horrible story. And someone might say, so you're saying that when he's talking about his mother, that he's actually talking about Tamar? That's absolutely the case. And you might say, that's the most preposterous, far-fetched thing I've ever heard. That was 10 generations back, and he's talking about her as his mother? How many generations is it from Jesus to David? And they call Jesus the son of David. Is it really preposterous? Is it 24 generations? From Jesus to David, and who do they call Jesus? The son of David. You see, these individuals kept up with their genealogy because it had to do with their land. And also, they all knew that the Messiah was going to come through the tribe of Judah. They kept up with it very meticulously because they lived on their tribal land. And the tribal land returned back to them every 50 years. And as David mourns about his condition, the fact that he has fornicated, the fact that he's lied, he has conspired with his captain, and he has killed Uriah, one of his great warriors who wouldn't even sleep with his own wife because all of his other comrades were out in war. And now the baby is going to die. And he writes this mournful psalm in which he says, "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity. And in sin did my mother conceive me." David did not say he was born in sin. He is referencing something that took place with his mother. Now, some individuals might even try to say, well, David doesn't know about this business, about the 10 generations. Don't fool yourself. Every single time they read through the book of Ruth, he would hear about his generations, his family line to the 10th generation. Every time they read through Deuteronomy 23 verse 2, he would hear that a bastard can't go into the congregation. And guaranteed he knew his daddy and his granddaddy and his great-granddaddy did not go into the convocation. They didn't go to the holy feast. They did not assemble in the great congregation. Why? Because they were the result of an incestuous relationship 10 generations back or 7 generations back, depending on which one it was, the grandfather or the great-grandfather. And in Psalm 122 verse 1, people, when they read Psalm 122 verse 1, they often just say, this is the way you ought to feel about going to church. Are you kidding? David was the first one for 10 generations who was able to go into the congregation or the house of the Lord. David knew exactly what was going on. And when he was mourning over his condition, he's simply looking at it and saying, you know what? This is what is expected of me. Why, the very way I came into this world, the very seed line of my family is a gory story, a horrible detail of incest, and the result being a bastard, an illegitimate child. And so, as he mourns, he says, "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." My friends, if you didn't know this, and you interpreted this and tried to say that David talked about him being born in sin and inheriting Adam's sin, that is just the most ridiculous thing anybody ever concocted. When in fact, these individuals recognized what was being said when they read about David's psalm. They knew that David knew about the sordid details of his conception and his family line. It was read constantly throughout time. Generation after generation after generation would hear it. And finally, at the end of 10 generations, David was able to go into the house of the Lord. David even built the house of the Lord. He didn't actually do the building, but he got everything ready for Solomon to build it. He got the goods together, and as a result of him having killed Uriah, he didn't get the privilege of building it, but he was involved. Now, here's the question tonight. Do you recognize that you actually don't recognize Scripture oftentimes because of not reading it? Had you been a diligent student of, say, Deuteronomy and Leviticus, where we talked about the 50th year and the land going back, you would have known why it was such a terrible thing for a person not to raise up children to his dead brother. Because you're keeping the land in the family. That's how that's working. You would also know Deuteronomy 23, too, about an illegitimate child and the results of an illegitimate child. And you would know that they would count. And a lot of people told me, they didn't count that stuff. Listen, they read it all the time. Everybody in Palestine, everybody in the whole nation of Israel knew about the sordid details associated with David's conception 10 generations back. These folks kept up with their generations, and they knew that Jesus was the son. A genealogy went all the way back to David. How did they know that? Because it was by design. Now, my friends, tonight, I want to ask you, can you come up with a scripture that says born in sin? Or is this just some other stuff that somebody told you? We are not born in sin. There is no scripture that says we're born in sin. And I stopped tonight with this individual right here. He's one of the preachers that promoted this, and he was in a debate with me. I'm going to let you listen to a little bit more.
Of the disease. The disease is sin, and therefore he's a sinner. He commits sin because he is a sinner.
The disease is sin, and you commit sin because you have the disease. Well, where'd you get the disease from? Well, it was passed down from Adam. Well, how do you know that? Psalm 51:5. Psalm 51:5 says that we've passed down sin from Adam. It doesn't say that at all. You see, my friends, this business about born in sin is not biblical at all. And that's why we're constantly challenging individuals to meet us on television and to demonstrate. We have these people calling up all the time. They say, well, my preacher said we were born in sin. Psalm 51:5. Is David really saying he was born in sin? Is David talking about his own conception? Or is he talking about the way in which he was brought into the world 10 generations back? Is David referencing his own sinfulness? It says, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Someone was involved in sin in the conception that brings David into the world. And guess what? Everybody in Israel knew exactly who it was. It was Tamar and Judah. And for 10 generations they suffered. They were not allowed to be associated at the special feasts and Sabbaths with the rest of the congregation. My friends, tonight I hope that you've enjoyed our broadcast, and I hope that you've learned something. And most of all, I hope that you are interested and curious enough to find out more. My phone number is 276-806-2150. It's always on. It's always available. We want you to know also that we have